All right, let me get this situated. I'm just going to send this last email. Okay. Chair Edwards, we are ready to begin.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to welcome everybody. Sorry for the little bit of a delay, but we're here for the FY22 budget development study session. And so with that, I will go ahead and kick it off to Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. And I am going to turn it over to Paul Hodgins and Tyler, who will run you through a review of the budget. And I'll give a little bit of an introduction. Paul will expand on that. And that is, we recognize we have some new board members. And we also recognize that with the complexity of our budget process and the two entity system and how we interact. So Paul has graciously agreed to provide an expanded and more detailed dive into this so that we can start out from a good place on the same time. So I'll turn it over to Paul and he can take it from here. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Chair, members of the boards, appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about our budget process and where we stand. Last year, around February, March, we were moving forward with our budget process. And when the pandemic really took hold and we had lockdowns and everything that went on with the pandemic, it kind of threw us into a lot of uncertainty. And as you recall, we had to pivot and make some decisions there. That's continued to affect us, a lot of the uncertainty. So we'll present some of that discussion today because it's impacting how we move forward with the budget process. As Mr. Smith said, we do have some slides in here that provide more background information, just kind of on what's in our budget, mostly for the new board members, just so they can understand, jumping into this in midstream, just understand what goes into our budget. So a little bit first about our process. The main committees that we discuss budget and budget assumption with, first is the financial working group. These are all staff members, typically either finance or transit staff from all of your cities. So this is your staff that we work with. We provide detailed assumptions, lots of backup information to them to review as part of the budget development process. We also review a lot of our assumptions and look for oversight and guidance from our audit and finance subcommittee, which is a board subcommittee representing both boards. And we ask them to make a recommendation to the boards on the budgets as we move towards approval. And finally, of course, the board of directors reviews and approves our annual operating and capital budgets for both Valley Metro RPTA and Valley Metro Rail. Quick look at our general budget timeline. We begin internally to develop our budget for the next fiscal year in September. This is almost a year-round process for us. We begin to develop input from all the divisions with our main goal that early to provide some preliminary operating budgets in October. We provide those to the financial working group for a quick review. We do that because Our operating budgets, the service we provide, are roughly half funded by local city revenues. And so to ensure that the cities have some information for their budget process, we do this preliminary operating budget in October. We continue to refine those assumptions, refine the inputs through January. Then in February, we present our annual budgets, our preliminary annual budgets to the financial working group, and then through March, through our committee process, our management committees, the audit and finance subcommittee, and the board for a review. We take April to incorporate comments from our first review process, and then come back through in May for adoption. We plan for May. That gives us some flexibility that if something comes up, such as COVID happened last year, we can take an extra month if we need it and still have budget adoption in June before the new fiscal year starts. We do have that buffer built in, but we target May for adoption. As I mentioned, we have that preliminary budget. We delivered that to the financial working group this year back in October. And again, the main focus of that preliminary budget is to provide some guidance to the cities for their own budget process. We look at planned service that we know at that point, our operations, maintenance, staffing, whether there are any strategic initiatives or planned improvements through our short-range transit program. We have a little extra contingency built in for this preliminary budget because our goal really is to provide you with a not to exceed amount. As we refine the budgets, we don't want to come back in February and say, no, we need more from the cities. We'd much rather give you that not to exceed and then refine it down to a number that then still fits within what you have in your budget process. So moving on, if we can start with the Regional Public Transportation Authority and starting with revenue forecasts. We have 4 key revenue sources that fund our operating revenues, our operating budget. We have federal revenues. Typically, in a normal year, those would be fairly small. Federal revenues are typically for capital only. We have a very small amount, but through the pandemic, we've received some stimulus funds through the CARES Act that's mainly applied in fiscal 21, the current fiscal year. We will have some amount that's carried forward into the new fiscal year. But then we have these new CRISA funds, and I haven't mastered what that acronym is, but it's the Coronavirus Something Relief Supplementary Appropriations Act. Or we affectionately call it CARES 2. These are additional funds that have been provided that will be applied during next fiscal year that we will program into the budget. And again, that other federal funds that we typically get, we just look at an inflationary increase year to year. Prop 400 is our other major source, is our main source of funding from the regional Prop 400 tax. And again, because of the uncertainty, we have 4 different forecast scenarios that we're working with that we've developed through the pandemic. Local revenues, as I mentioned, the city revenues fund about half of the service, so that's an important source of revenue for us. And then fare revenues, typically a much larger part of the budget. This year, ridership and fare revenue being down significantly. But I'll touch on each of those 4 revenue sources just a little bit more. So moving on, the CARES Act. Again, this was passed and signed into law last March, at the end of last March. It was, I believe, overall about a $2.2 trillion package. It provided $25 billion for public transportation, which is really intended to support our ongoing operations. The Federal Transit Administration really wanted to get it out there to support operations, to ensure that we could make up for lost fare revenue, for any lost local revenues, to keep service on the street for those essential workers that rely on public transportation. FTA allocated those funds to urbanized areas, to regions using their existing formulas. And so the funds that came to our area, we have 2 urbanized areas within our region, the Phoenix Mesa UZA and the Avondale Goodyear UZA. So we received some funding to both those UZAs, and then Arizona Department of Transportation also received some funds through the Rural Assistance Program, and we were able to secure some of those to support our rural connector coming up from Ajo and Gila Bend. As I mentioned, we may have some minimal carryover from what came to the region for fiscal 22. We believe the Phoenix Mesa UZA money will be largely spent down this fiscal year. We should have some carryover in the Avondale Goodyear UZA. We will have spent all of the ADOT funds for the rural support, though. The new funds, the CRISA funds, this is providing an additional $14 billion for public transportation out of, I believe, the $900 billion or so nationally for support, for stimulus support. FTAs has pushed that it, just like the CARES Act, it is intended to support ongoing operations so we can keep service going, maintain our workforce, and make up for any of those lost revenues. Again, they've allocated it using their existing formulas. The big difference with these CRISA funds is that they've included a cap for urbanized areas. So for the MAG region, for the Maricopa County region, we are subject to those caps. So the Phoenix Mesa urban area is receiving about $85.26 million, which gets us to the cap that's in the law. But the CARES Act money that we received puts us over the cap. So there's no additional funding for the Avondale Goodyear UZA through the CRISA. Looking quickly at how those funds that came to the Phoenix Mesa UZA, as I mentioned, $85.26 million. MAG will allocate those. They've indicated that they will use the same allocation formula they used for the CARES Act funds. So the allocations we're showing here, we developed. We haven't got the final estimates from, or the final calculation from MAG, but we believe that this will be fairly close based on how the CARES Act was allocated. They start with an initial sub-allocation for rail, and then the bus and paratransit, and then 2 specific transit operators within those allocations. So Valley Metro Rail would receive somewhere in the neighborhood of $20.5 million. Glendale, Peoria, Phoenix, and Scottsdale will receive some allocation of the bus and paratransit funding, and Valley Metro RPTA just likely a little under $20 million to support service for next year. So I want to quickly explain, I won't spend too much time on this, how we apply those revenues and why they're important to us. So this is using our fiscal 21 adopted budget as an example. We have a column for our fixed route that's operated by Valley Metro and our demand services, paratransit and ride choice. So we accumulate all of the costs associated with those services. So for fiscal 21, our budget for fixed route, as an example, is $91 million. Our demand services, just a little over $31 million. We have to take off fare revenue to get to kind of a net operating cost. So $88.8 million for fixed route, $31 million for the demand services. Then we would apply those CARES Act revenues against those funding. Those are what are eligible for the CARES Act funds. So we have $37 million programmed for the fixed route. The first $7 million or so are really dedicated to making up that lost fare revenue. The $2 million programmed is really about $7 million less than we would have normally received. We're typically in the $9 million range for fare revenue in a year. So $7 million of that CARES Act revenue offsets the lost fare revenue. The other $30 million then offsets the operating costs and reduces that net subsidy that's required from both the regional Prop 400 funds and our member city funding. So without those CARES Act funds, that net cost would be somewhere upwards of $76 million. But with those CARES Act, we're around $46 million. So that's how it supports any lost or reduced local or regional revenues. So that's why it's really important to us to have this additional CRISA funding for fiscal 22 to support those local revenues as well as make up for any lost fare revenue. I could dive just a little bit into our Prop 400, our public transportation funds. This is a half-cent sales tax. It has a 20-year life that was passed in Prop 400 back in November of 2004. The tax took effect, there's a little typo, it was January 2006 through December of 2025. So it's a 20-year tax. About a third of that comes to the public transportation fund. That's managed by the RPTA. That's what we use for bus service, paratransit service to support some of the light rail construction in the region. The other 2/3 goes to the regional area road fund that's managed by the Arizona Department of Transportation for the freeway and arterial programs as part of Prop 400. Looking at our forecasting process for those half-cent revenues, the Prop 400 tax was an extension of an earlier half-cent tax that supported a lot of the freeway construction in the region that had been managed by ADOT. They developed what they call a risk analysis process. It's a sophisticated econometric model using independent variables. They have a panel that they bring together every year, a panel of experts, economists, experts on our local and our national economy, demographers who provide input on population growth. They come together each year and evaluate the forecast for all those independent variables. It was a very good process developed during the previous Prop 300. We've continued to use it through Prop 400, so ADOT manages that on behalf of RPTA and MAG for all of the life cycle programs. They publish that forecast annually. This year it was published in September of 2020. So the next slide, if you allow me to explain a little bit, it provides some history of the forecasts that ADOT has developed over time. So if we look at the far left bar labeled RTP, this is the 20-year forecast total that was developed back in 2003 for the regional transportation plan that became the basis for Prop 400. At that time, we were estimating about $4.8 billion from the Prop 400 revenue tax coming to transit. The next bar over, 2006, published in late 2006, you can see a small amount of purple at the bottom. That represents the actual revenues collected when the tax took effect in January of 2006 through June of 2006. So it's a half year of actuals and 19 and a half years of forecast, and that year was about $5 billion. So as we move forward, you can see that the actual revenues each year grow as time goes behind us, and the forecast period shrinks a little bit. Two things to note. Through the Great Recession, you can see the 20-year forecast total drops significantly. 2006, it was about $5 billion. By 2010, that forecast was $2.9 billion. So it's about a 40% decrease in the revenues we expected to support Prop 400, which is why you see a lot of the projects that were in Prop 400 were deferred or reduced in scope. The other thing to note really is that since 2010, those forecasts developed by ADOT have been really consistent. You know, minor increases or decreases each year, but typically it's in the $2.8 to $2.9 billion range and has been really consistent for the last 11 forecasts. And we believe will be generally consistent through the end of the program at the end of calendar 2025. Obviously, as I mentioned, the COVID pandemic, the health emergency has had a significant impact on the way we look at revenues with a lot of uncertainty. You know, this hit back about 10 months ago. As we finalized our fiscal 21 budget, there was a lot of uncertainty moving forward. We developed 3 scenarios in-house through the summer that we presented in August of 2020. Those scenarios, because we didn't really know which way revenues were going to go long term, so those scenarios really looked at 3 different levels of impact. The first one was really a moderate impact initially, followed by some steady growth. The second one really modeled our revenues after what happened post 9/11, where we had a couple of years of impact, but then some steady growth. And the third scenario looked at what happened or modeled kind of what happened after the Great Recession, where we had significant decreases for 3 or 4 years before we actually saw some positive growth after that. So those are the scenarios we developed by August. As I mentioned, ADOT's updated their forecast in September. So we have those 4 forecasts that we're looking at right now as part of the budget process. Continuing to monitor our revenues in fiscal 21 relative to those 4 forecasts so we can make some determination when we bring our final budget in May on which forecast is most appropriate given our current revenue trends and where we believe revenues are going in the future through fiscal 22 and the remainder of Prop 400. So we'll have a conservative budget that we believe reflects a realistic and appropriate revenue forecast. Just looking at those 4 different forecast scenarios, fiscal 21, the current year we're in, those scenario forecasts range from 171 million roughly down to 151 million. For 22, which we're planning right now, and then through the 5 years, 22 through 26, if we look at those 5-year totals, ADOT's forecast shows about 900 million through the next 5 years. Our more conservative scenario is about 895 million over the 5 years. It's a little lower in the first couple of years, a little higher towards the end, so it's a little different distribution than ADOT's forecast. Scenario 2, our post 9/11 like scenario, is about 100 million less than scenario 1, 795 million over the 5 years. And our Great Recession type scenario is 671 million, so a significant decrease, about 26% less than the official forecast. So that would be kind of our worst case scenario if we see trends going in that direction. So looking at our current trends, we have now 6 months of revenues for fiscal 21. And right now, we are sitting at about 6.9 million above budget. So trending well above budget, well above our fiscal 20 actuals, which is important, but also when we look at the actuals month by month, it's very consistent from month to month. We didn't start out strong and then have decreases through the rest of the 6 months. It's been pretty consistent. So given that we have some additional stimulus through CRISA, there's additional stimulus that the new administration is talking about, another 1.9 trillion, I believe is the number I heard, to support the economy, to support vaccine rollout. So with those additional stimulus in place and seeing that our revenue trend is fairly consistent, we feel comfortable that the rest of fiscal 21 will likely be consistent with the first 6 months. So looking at the chart on the next page, it says, okay, so we have our 4 forecasts that I mentioned for fiscal 21. The ADOT forecast on the left, the 171 million down to the 151 in scenario 3. And if we believe our current trend, as I mentioned, stays consistent through the rest of this year, fiscal 21 will end at about 178 million, which is above all of those forecast levels. So we feel comfortable that our current trend is in a positive direction, and we're looking at being a little more conservative and using our scenario 1, which is kind of that conservative scenario. It's a little bit less than ADOT's official forecast. So we're using that scenario 1 as kind of our base forecast for the budget, but obviously we'll have some contingencies that we'll talk about in a moment. Local revenues, we talk about those just briefly. We are seeing generally the same positive trend. I'm showing on this chart, 4 of the cities that we've received some data from: Glendale, Phoenix, Tempe, and Mesa, representing transaction privilege tax revenues for those cities. All of them our actual performance is better than forecast, but the actual performance in 21 really varies from city to city. PTF, as I mentioned, we're over 8% above fiscal 20. Mesa is over 10% above fiscal 20. Tempe is about 1.2%. So although the trend is positive, every city has a different experience. So we're optimistic that the trend is positive, but clearly we'll work with each city to look at their individual budget scenarios and what they need to do to address any contingencies for the cities. So going to the next slide, as I mentioned, we're working on scenario 1. We feel comfortable that our current trends will continue. and that scenario one is a conservative revenue forecast for us moving forward. It does not require any reductions in service to meet the budget. So we're able to continue with our current service levels given the revenue forecast for our Prop 400 funds, given the additional CRISA support for transit. What scenario one does, though, is it looks at any improvements that were programmed in our short-range transit program and just defers those out. So we're not planning to improve service, but we don't need to reduce service. Should those trends and revenues start to decline and we have to pivot to a different scenario, we are currently working with our service planning working group, which again involves all of your city staff, on what that contingency plan looks like. And for scenario two, roughly speaking, it would be about a 15% reduction in service levels from what we have today through the end of Prop 400, about a 5% reduction in fleet replacement, fleet purchases, our regional services, and then all of our mobility services. Scenario three, we haven't fully developed yet, but it would be roughly double that, a 30% decrease in service and 10% decrease to fleet and some of our other support services. Yeah, we're working through that with our service planning working group, and we have some detailed mileage assumptions for what's in our budget that we've sent out to the cities for some input. We will continue to work with your cities, again, on those locally funded services as needed. Looking quickly at fare revenues, we are well below budget in fiscal 21. A couple of reasons for that. So just as a note, we're about 16% of pre-pandemic levels. So part of that is that we have lower ridership. We're only at about 2/3 of what we were pre-pandemic on bus service. And rear door boarding, one of the things we did to manage, to protect our operators and to kind of manage through the pandemic is to have all of our passengers board through the rear door, which doesn't allow for swiping or tapping their fare media through the fare box, which is at the front door. So that is, so even though our ridership's about 2/3, that's why our revenue is really down to 16%, much lower than normal, just because of that, mainly that rear door boarding that doesn't allow us to really enforce the fares. We are moving forward in fiscal 22. We believe we will return to that full fare enforcement, return to that front door boarding so we can manage our fare revenue a little better, so we can manage that fare media, make sure that passengers have the fares. We are anticipating a slight increase, bringing back ridership. Right now we're about 2/3, looking at maybe about 80% of pre-pandemic levels. And so not back fully to where we were, but regain some of that ridership. I won't spend much time on this. We do have a ridership recovery plan that we presented to the board probably a couple of months ago. It's a phased approach and involves a lot of passenger communications, and as I mentioned, that front door boarding, returning to front door boarding. So we do have a plan in place to help bring those riders back over the next couple of years. So let me pause there quickly. I did a lot of talking about the revenues. I want to see if there are any specific questions from any of the board members before I move on to the expense side.
Anybody have any questions?
John, it's Lauren. I have a question.
Yeah, Lauren.
Thank you. So Paul, when do you anticipate, I mean, fiscal year 2022, when do you anticipate being able to return to front door boarding? I mean, that seems to me that's probably going to be not until, sometime towards maybe the end of summer, probably at the earliest.
Councilmember Tolmachoff, I think one of the driving factors here is to get those operator barriers. We've talked about installing those permanent operator barriers across the regional fleet that will protect the operators. We started installation of those, I believe, at the end of last month with the City of Phoenix fleet. This month, we've begun installation, I believe, on our Valley Metro fleet. We anticipate having those fully installed probably by May. So With that in place, we believe that provides adequate protection for the operators that we can return to that front door boarding either by June or we think July at the latest. I don't know.
So you anticipate, if I can continue, John, then you anticipate the fare recovery to be pretty immediate with that, or that's all part of the, increased ridership plan?
Well, we don't anticipate that on day one, we'll have our fare revenues back to normal levels, but it will support, we'll be able to enforce that all passengers have fares. We'll be able to ensure that for those with platinum passes, for instance, they're able to tap and we're able to recover those fares. So it will definitely increase the fare enforcement, ensuring that everybody has fares, but obviously we're not returning to full ridership. So we don't anticipate having all of our fare revenue recovered in fiscal 22, but it'll be certainly a step in the right direction. And again, those CRISA funds, those additional federal funds will be there in place to supplement any of those lost fare revenues next year as we build back to full ridership, full fare recovery.
Okay. Thank you, John. I have one other question. I don't know whether there's been any internal discussion, if you've had any discussions with the county about standing up routes we don't have a lot of vaccine pods yet, but we serve a population who, relies on us for transportation. So I don't know if there's been any discussion yet about providing, unless it's already on an existing route, I believe we should be at least thinking about standing up some routes to get people to the vaccine pods. That's going to be really important to, the overall health of our community, but it's, the health of our economy and increase our ridership. We need to be part of making sure that these vaccines are available. And that means making sure people have transportation to the vaccine pods. That's my question.
Councilmember Tomlichoff, this is Alexis. I do want to confirm that we have had those internal discussions and we're looking at where those pods are coming online. Up until recently, I believe we were looking at those locations, and I believe it's GCU has just recently announced that they have or will be coming a pod for vaccines, which is located on a transit route. We know that the state and the county are in conversations with major retail chains like Walgreens, CVS, similar to the process of testing that we went through earlier in the year. If I recall, I believe you board members had received a letter that we sent to the county and also went to Department of Health Services, standing ready to help them in their vaccine distribution, making sure that they have access to transit routes so that we have, and individuals who do not have access to personal vehicles have an opportunity for walk-up sites. And so I think in addition to that coordination, as the state and the county continue to work out their vaccine rollout and making sure that the supply is there, we have not only had the internal conversations, we've had also initial conversations with the city of Phoenix of how we can stand ready to help that process.
Okay, thank you. So just one question along that same line of thinking. I would think that because is there a set aside in the budget for funding this transportation, or has there been any discussion? How's that going to be funded? Some of the CARES money, I would imagine some of the CARES money Valley Metro received was intended to help with this sort of thing.
Yes. The CARES funds and also the CRISA funds that have been made available can certainly support any additional service, whether it's bus service or paratransit service for trips to vaccination sites. It's absolutely an eligible cost, and we could certainly look at how we could accomplish that with some of the federal funds we have.
Okay, thank you.
If I can add to that, Paul, Councilmember Tomlichoff, we did the same in anticipation of having that level of service for testing sites and had communicated that to our transit service providers, particularly our paratransit early on and during the pandemic, March or April. We did have a few bites of that apple, so to speak, from users in which we transported folks to testing sites. The demand was not as big as we had initially thought, but as Paul indicated, we had planned to use CARES Act funding, and in addition, with the CRISA funding for fiscal 22, we would have that option as well.
Okay, because I would imagine a lot of our users are frontline workers. And so, I mean, it's an important, and my main question was, literally, are we going to be setting some money aside so that we're able to fund that? Because like I said, a lot of the people we serve are frontline workers, grocery store and other frontline jobs that need transportation to vaccine sites.
Absolutely. Thank
Yeah,
you.
this is Jack.
Yes, Jeff.
I will just comment quickly that right now, the only walk-up site for vaccine available is at GCU. That will be expanded when we start getting vaccine sites at Safeway and CVS and places like that. But that's depending on when vaccine actually becomes available. Right now, all the vaccine that I know of that's available is already spoken for people that have made appointments. At least that's the case at all the county sites.
Thank you, Jack.
Mr. Chair, this is Bill.
Yes, Bill, go ahead.
Paul, I've got two questions. One is on slide 19, which was the revenue projection slide. I don't know if you can go back to it or not. So these revenues, I just want to be clear for everybody, they do or do not include COVID relief monies.
No, Vice Mayor Stipp, these are strictly sales tax, the transaction privilege tax revenues for Prop 400. This does not include any federal revenue. This does not include any city revenue. This is strictly our Prop 400 revenues.
Right. So I just want to make sure for everybody that was very clear as we move forward. My second question was on the return to ridership. One of the revenue projections for FY22 counts on an 80% return to ridership based on pre-COVID numbers. How big of an impact is it if they don't? Let's say that the ridership stays at the same level that it has been since the beginning of the pandemic, if you will, which was, between 50 and 70% reduction in ridership. How does that affect these fare revenues and the budget going forward?
Certainly if ridership doesn't come back immediately, as I said, we're at about 2/3 right now in terms of on the bus service side. If it stays at 2/3, obviously our fare revenue doesn't come back. The biggest impact on getting our fare revenue really is going back to front door boarding. So the difference between 2/3 of pre-pandemic levels and 80%, I'd have to do the math, but we're probably talking about maybe $1 million in fare revenue. And so that would be, these CRISA revenues, these new federal revenues, one of the things that's really going to help with is any of that lost revenue. So if ridership doesn't come back, if we don't have the fare revenues we estimate, those federal revenues will help to offset that.
Okay, thank you, appreciate it.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Chair Edwards, this is Robin.
Yes, Robin.
Hey, thank you. Really quick. Just a couple of things. I definitely like Councilmember Tomachoff's idea about, you know, the ability to be able to set some dollars aside. So I didn't know if we needed to have that further discussion. I think for things that are uncertain that might come up, things that we can help with, maybe certain programs to not only for, you know, residents within Arizona, but, you know, even our own employees as they work to try to get the vaccine, whatever that might be. Instead of having to try to pull it somewhere later, I definitely would support that. I think that's good. Also, you know, Bill talked about slide number 19. I just want to kind of talk a little bit about slide 23 when we talk about higher revenues. And one of the things I know this board as a whole and the Audit and Finance Subcommittee has always talked about is fair recovery and what that looks like and fair enforcement. Now, obviously, when we go back to front door boarding, I think that's going to definitely be helpful. But I think at the same time, this might be a really good opportunity for us to really discover and explore what our program could look like to ensure better fair recovery in the future. And I don't know if that's happening. I know we've got a lot of moving parts right now and there's a lot of uncertainties, but some of the things that, you know, I think we could really kind of nail down just a little bit and would really help us on the revenue side too, and understand a little bit more certainly what that might look like. Thank you, Chair.
Councilmember Arredondo Savage, I appreciate that. We do have, as we've talked about before, a project that we are working with in conjunction with Phoenix to replace the entire fare collection system in the region. And it's not just replacing like for like, we are upgrading. We are bringing in mobile ticketing so that our passengers can use their cell phones to have tickets to get on bus and light rail, a much wider distribution of smart cards, a much stricter reduced fare, requiring a reduced fare ID that's the fare media so that we can manage those reduced fare users and make sure that only those that are really eligible for reduced fares are able to use reduced fares. So we are despite the pandemic, we are continuing with that project and moving forward. We could certainly at some point in the near future provide an update on that project to the Audit and Finance Subcommittee if you'd like to hear it, or to the full board if the board would like to hear about that project. But that is moving forward despite the pandemic.
Yeah,
so that
well,
will certainly
I
help.
think that's, yeah, no, I know. And that's one thing that we've been talking about. I think we were talking more about short term, and I get that, and things are a little bit different. But I don't like to speak for the Audit and Finance Subcommittee, but I will and say, yes, we would like to have an update to presentation in the very near future. You guys,
I think as the chair, you get to speak for the subcommittee.
Okay. I'm sure they'll tell me what they think later.
And one other thing, this is Scott, if I could just expand on what Councilmember Stipp said, you know, not to celebrate because it's too early to celebrate, but certainly we like the idea that we have almost $7 million through the first 6 months that we were not expecting in revenue. We also have seen many of our expenses because of a change in activity, teleworking, things like that, that have been reduced. So we do have capacity within our budget to handle things such as if we choose to provide services to vaccination sites. We're fortunate that right now we do have some cushion in our budget that would enable us to certainly explore some of those issues. And I don't, you know, even though fare revenue has taken a dive, we feel very, very good that our sales tax, our Prop 400 revenues have provided us somewhat of a windfall that gives us a little bit of cushion to be able to actively explore some of these options that would help everyone get through the COVID, for example.
Hey, John, it's Lauren again.
Yeah, Lauren.
I support Robin's request, and I think it would be really helpful for us to know basically like what would a bare bones budget be. You know, I mean, we obviously have, you know, hard costs that are you know, regardless of the revenues that we're, you know, obligated, and, you know, contracts and construction and other things like that. But I mean, I don't know if you could even, maybe if you don't want to run it as a separate budget, but just give us the data so we can see that we know, like, minimally, these are things that are basically, you know, that have to be in our budget.
Good point. Yeah, I like that.
I hear whispering.
I said that's a good point. I like that.
Oh, I don't think it was you. I think it was
Oh,
I think it was from the boardroom. But I mean, I just think that that's kind of been our concern all along is we don't really know what the future holds. I mean, it seems like things are moving in a better direction, but and hopefully President Biden, is able to roll out 100 million vaccines in 100 days. I mean, I think we're all hopeful that that's the case, but this could linger on all the way through, the next fiscal year before we're able to really resume, normal. So I, I mean, and I wouldn't say I'm a doomsday person, but I'm a give me all the information kind of person. And I think the board, I would think, would like to know, like, minimally, what are we looking at? And then we can make decisions about other things when we know what we must do. And then we can look at what other priorities may be. But I would like to know what is a must for the budget.
so Paul, what's a realistic time frame to put something like that together and get it out to the board so that we could look at it prior to the actual budget discussions that happen in April?
Mr. Chair, it's hard to say. I mean, we are working towards having a preliminary budget basically by the end of February. We could try to look at what we believe are must-haves versus really like to have. We've already eliminated what we believe are kind of the nice-to-haves.
Mm-hmm.
Our travel is way down. We've reduced our training budget. We've frozen a lot of positions. So we're already at a point where we think we're close to that bare bones, and I'm not sure I know how to bare bones.
I think if Paul can go through the costs, I think it'll give a better picture because he can tell you where the flexibility in the budget is.
Okay.
And he'll show you in some of those that the vast majority of our costs are in actual providing service.
Yeah.
Running buses, running paratransit, running trains. That's where our costs come in. And so I think if Paul can go through some of the costs, it'll give you a better context as to what might be available when we talk about bare bones, what exactly it means. And then we can sort of talk about what that is. Because I think you'll see that the flexibility within the budget is pretty stark as far as if you cut, it's got to come from certain areas. So if it's okay, if Paul can go on with the cost, maybe it'll give us more context to have that conversation after the cost side.
Yeah, and look, I think we all realize that, and we're not asking for, we're just looking at every opportunity that we don't want to get to the 11th hour and find out that we're not prepared. And so I think Lauren and Robin had valid points, and Paul, go ahead with the presentation. But I think we all want to down the line want to see that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So moving on to some of the uses of funds, I've got a couple of slides just to provide an overview of what's included in RPTA's budget, particularly for our new board members. If you go to the next slide, Pat, please, or Alexis, sorry. So using our fiscal 21 adopted budget as just as a guide to provide some context, operations, our fixed route bus service, our paratransit and ride choice service, our van pool service is about $136 million for fiscal 21, which is about 85% of our total operating budget. So as Scott said, the majority of our operating budget is really dedicated to providing service. The next piece, the regional services, 14 million. Those are services that support operations. So it's our customer service call center, anybody that calls 602-253-5000 for information. That's all paid through this regional services. We have our mobility center, which provides support for certifying for ADA passengers for paratransit, for instance, provides travel training for passengers to help them navigate the system. It includes our website, our marketing efforts, our transit book. So these are all things that directly support operations is another $14 million. The next slide is really a lot of those more discretionary type areas. So our commute solutions, I'll note that that's 100% grant funded through both Maricopa County and the Maricopa Association of Governments. They do our clean air campaign, the Share the Ride. They work with the travel reduction program with employers throughout the county. It's about 1.3 million. Our planning team, our planning budget is about $2 million. A lot of that is dedicated to our service planning and working with the cities on our biannual service changes, working on our short range transit program. And then the executive office, our administrative, that's finance, procurement, kind of those support functions for the agency, about 4.1 million. So really, when we look at those discretionary type costs that aren't directly related to service, it's 2 million in planning, 4 million for administrative support out of a $170-some million operating budget. So it really is, not a lot of flexibility there. We couldn't address a lot of revenue shortfalls by simply trimming our administrative budget because it's already a fairly small part of the overall budget. This last category, pass-through funds, 39 million. These are costs that are in our budget, but they're really for other agencies. They're just pass-throughs. So we have salary, fringe, and overhead. The Valley Metro Rail staff technically are RPTA employees, but we are reimbursed 100% for all of their costs by Valley Metro Rail. We also get some lottery funds that we then distribute to the cities and towns in the county to support public transportation. So it's money in, money out. So we kind of separate those out as pass-through funds. That's 39 million. Looking very quickly at our capital budget, the biggest piece here, regional fleet that supports our bus fleet, our paratransit fleet, ensuring that we have buses to run, regional facilities and administrative facilities, transit centers, park and rides, upgrades to our maintenance facilities, other regional projects. The main thing there is our fare collection project that I mentioned. Member agency disbursements. These are direct payments to our cities for Prop 400 projects. For example, Prop 400 anticipated that it would pay for the replacement of all regional fleet, not just the fleet operated by Valley Metro. So when Phoenix or Glendale replaces their fleet, they pay for it, they draw federal funds, and then we reimburse them for the local match with our Prop 400 funds. So that's what that represents. Debt service for the debt issuances that we've had, then pass-throughs. This is primarily funding, Prop 400 funding that we pass through to Valley Metro Rail for light rail planning and construction. So that's just a very high level on the main elements of what goes into our operating and capital budgets. As I mentioned, operations are 86% of our overall operating budget. So we focus a little bit more on what drives those costs. So for fiscal year 21 on our fixed route bus, that's $104 million, the budget that we have. It's primarily 86%, seems to be a popular number. 86% of those costs are directly related to our service contracts. So we have a contract with First Transit to provide service in the East Valley, with Total Ride in the West Valley. And those are really driven by the miles, the service that we ask them to operate, and the cost per mile, the costs that are in the contracts. An additional 6% are for fuel, again, directly related to the miles that we operate, about 5% to support facilities maintenance, and about 3% of the costs are administrative support. So that would be some additional liability insurance that we purchase. It would be our staffing to provide contract oversight for our contracts, to ensure that maintenance is done. So those types of costs that we have, about 3% of the overall budget. So diving a little bit more into those main drivers, our service levels, as I mentioned, we're not planning to reduce service next year, at least for regionally funded service, but we're also not increasing. So this is our fiscal 21 miles that we use as a base. On the left, we have those locally or city funded services, lots of circulator services, some express and some local, just about 7 million or so, just under 7 million miles. On the right side, we have those regionally funded, Prop 400 funded services. Circulators are not eligible for those regional funds, so we don't have any circulator there. A lot of express service and a lot of local service for about 14.6 million miles that we're planning on. Again, roughly half city funded, half regionally funded. Then the other piece of what goes into those contract costs are the rates. So as I mentioned, we have First Transit. They're our provider for East Valley bus services. Their contract took effect back in fiscal 14. It was a maximum 10-year contract. There are no more options, so it expires at the end of fiscal 23. So we have contractual rates for both fiscal 22 and 23. We will have to re-procure a new contract. So for our 5-year forecast horizon, we've made some assumptions based on inflationary increases for 24 through 26. But obviously, the procurement that we do in the next couple of years will really drive what those costs end up being. Then on our West Valley service with Total Ride, I believe we're in the 3rd year of a 10-year contract. So all of those rates for our 5-year planning horizon here, fiscal 22 through 26, they're all set in the contract. Currently, they provide circulator and express services for us. You'll note the express is significantly higher than the circulators. It's a peak period service, so we have split shifts that drives up the cost, and really the deadhead associated with every trip. So a bus pulls out of the garage, does one express trip, and then it typically goes back. So there's a significant amount of non-revenue service, and that drives up that average cost per mile. So that's why you see a significant difference there in what we pay for the express. So some of the
If I could on that, one of the things to be careful of, or we need to be careful of, is that as you look at the new administration and some of the proposals, there's a lot of momentum and weight among, related to national minimum wage. This would impact those contracts going forward, depending on how that came out. Even if we have current operators who make above whatever is proposed, that certainly would have the, as we would all have to deal with the fact of the potential that could raise the base across the board, which might affect any of these contracts going forward. So we're just guessing right now beyond fiscal 23 on the East Valley as to what that might be, but that's just something to keep in the back of your mind.
Thanks, Scott. So looking at some of those other areas, as I mentioned, fuel is about 6% of our fixed route bus budget. We are primarily a natural gas fleet. We do have some diesel fueled fleet. Those prices, particularly for natural gas, have been fairly stable. So it's a fairly confident in those forecasts for fuel costs. And again, those are directly related to the service miles operated. So as we adjust service, we adjust our fuel estimate. The other area is facilities. That typically doesn't change with service levels. It's just strictly the upkeep of our 2 maintenance facilities, the one in Mason, the one in Tempe. So typically a 3 to 5% inflationary increase from our current budget. So a couple of slides on our demand services. And if I could just step back for a moment, we have 2 types of services that we consider demand services. We have our paratransit, and then we have our ride choice. So our paratransit service is really dedicated to what we call the Americans with Disabilities Act complementary paratransit service. So everywhere where we have fixed route bus service, within 3/4 of a mile of that bus service, we are required to provide this paratransit service to users who cannot use the bus. So as I mentioned, we have our mobility center. That's our certification office. So anybody who needs to be certified to use this paratransit service goes through that certification process. Once they're certified, we cannot deny these trips if they are within that mandatory service area for the paratransit. We have to provide that service during the same hours of fixed route bus service and the same days that bus service is provided. Our ride choice service, on the other hand, is not a federally required service. It's an option that we provide, and so we are better able to control those costs, and you'll see that on the contract rate slide next. Really, it acts more like we would call a taxi service. If you go, not quite ready for that slide. But It acts more like a taxi service. It allows, I think it's 8 miles for the trip, any miles above that, and the passenger has to pay the full cost of those additional miles. So we're better able to control our subsidy of those trips and the fare that we charge. Whereas with the paratransit service, we are limited to a $4 fare. Even if it's a 30-mile trip, it's a $4 fare. Whereas with the ride choice, we're better able to manage those costs, and the rider pays for additional costs there. So again, as with the bus service, the service contracts are the majority of these costs, 92%. We're estimating about 677,000 trips. It's a $31 million budget in fiscal 21. And our contracts are really based on a cost per trip that drives the overall budget. Fuel's an additional 5%, and our administrative support is about 4% of this budget. So again, looking at this next slide, our rates, the paratransit service, because it's a required service, we have to have it out there. We're limited on what we can charge for fares. It's a much higher cost per trip, well over $40 per trip, whereas with the ride choice, it's just over $20 per trip. We are currently working with your cities, with your city staff to restructure those contracts a little bit, looking at that paratransit service in particular on how we can better procure a contract to hopefully be a little cheaper, restructure some of the ways we deliver that service. So we're looking at fiscal 23 to implement whatever that new service is. So we have some preliminary rates for our 5-year forecast, but really what's guaranteed, I shouldn't say guaranteed, what's in the contract is through fiscal 22, and we'll re-procure these new contracts that are restructured starting in fiscal 23. So those were kind of the main drivers on our operating costs for services, which are, as I said, the bulk of our operating budget. That's really what I wanted to cover for the RPTA today. So were there any questions, specific questions on the RPTA budget before we move on to Valley Metro Rail? Sounds like there are none. Thank you. So moving on to Valley Metro Rail.
You have a question?
Oh, sorry, was there a question? No? Okay.
You're good, Paul. Go ahead.
Thank you. So moving on to Valley Metro Rail, again, beginning with our revenue forecasts. Federal funds, not typically a large part of the budget, but with the CARES Act and the CRISA, it's certainly much more important this year and next year. For Valley Metro Rail, we do not anticipate having any CARES Act funds carried over to fiscal 22. We believe we will draw them all down and apply them all in fiscal 21. So we do have the new CRISA funds, though, that will be applied against fiscal 22 operating costs. And those other federal sources, about a 1.5% increase. Fares, again, we're looking at kind of that ridership and fare revenue and fare enforcement. We'll talk a little bit about that. We also do advertising on Valley Metro Rail. We do not do that with RPTA. So we're currently negotiating our contract with our Outfront Media, our advertising provider. We've made a very conservative estimate for fiscal 22 and also in our current year, fiscal 21, very conservative given the uncertainty of the pandemic. So a little bit about the CRISA. We talked a little more detail about the allocations and how they get distributed out when we talked about RPTA. So looking specifically, though, at the Valley Metro Rail, we're looking at around $20.5 million coming to Valley Metro Rail. That will all be applied directly against services that are 100% locally funded. Our regional Prop 400 funds cannot pay for light rail or streetcar operating costs. And so we're applying all of the CRISA against those operating costs. And we have an estimate of how that $20 million would be allocated among the 3 cities. I do want to note that we are now anticipating the Tempe streetcar to begin operations in the fall of 2021. So we have, I believe, 8 months of operations built in. So we do have some CRISA allocations towards the Tempe streetcar, but you can see by city kind of how those get allocated out. And again, this is an estimate. We don't have the final numbers from MAG, but this is our internal estimate, just to give you some orders of magnitude. Looking at our fare revenues, in terms of what we're seeing compared to pre-pandemic, it's about the same as our bus service, about 16%, so much lower. Ridership, on the other hand, we're only at about 43% of our pre-pandemic levels. Our rail ridership has taken a little bigger hit than our bus service, and we've gone to more of a visual fare enforcement so that our security officers do not have to handle the fare media. So previously, in doing fare inspections, they would take the pass or the platinum pass or whatever fare media the passenger had. They'd use their handheld validator, they'd swipe, they'd tap, they'd ensure that it's valid media. But so that we don't have to handle the fares to minimize contact and minimize exposure, we went to just a visual fare enforcement. So they just ask, do you have a fare? If they show us a card, then we move on. So that's part of why we're down, our fare revenue is down much lower than ridership is down. But we do anticipate moving back to full fare enforcement at the same time that we move back to a front door boarding on the bus system. So likely by the end of this fiscal year or early in next fiscal year. So we will be, full fare enforcement involves ensuring not just that the passenger has a pass, but it's a valid pass and that they've tapped or swiped so that we can collect those fares. So we do anticipate, again, a little bit of ridership recovery for next year through our ridership recovery plan. Right now, we're at about 43% of pre-pandemic levels, so we're looking at coming back to about a 60% level of pre-pandemic levels. As with the bus service, we apply revenues generally in the same way. So I won't spend a lot of time. We accumulate our costs. So for fiscal 21, where we're operating just a light rail, it's about $57 million in costs, $2.7 million in fare revenue. Then we apply our CARES Act and other federal funds. So for fiscal 21, the net cost to the 3-member cities is about $10 million on a $57 million, almost $58 million operating budget. So the new CRISA revenues obviously will help to support those member cities in fiscal 22. So looking at high level on the operating budget for Valley Metro Rail, primarily rail operations, $58 million. We did have streetcar operations and maintenance in our current fiscal 21 budget. At the time we prepared the budget, we were looking at a May of 21 implementation. So that's why we have light rail and streetcar operations listed, but due to issues with our streetcar provider and COVID, they've had some delays in getting parts and manufacturing. That's been pushed out to fall. But the current budget shows about $58 million for operations, maintenance, and our safety and security. Project development, about another $12 million. That's our planning, a lot of corridor planning. So all the work that's involved. And right now we're looking at Capital I-10 West extension, phase 1 and phase 2. So all the work that goes into developing those corridors to become light rail extensions, that's part of that corridor planning, and we do some system planning. Much more planning intense than RPTA. $2 million budget there, $12 million here, but it's really related to those corridor planning and development. And lastly, what we call agency operations, which is really the administrative support, if you will, for the agency. It includes the executive office, some administrative support or government relations, those types of things, about $1.8 million. So looking at what some of those drivers are that are pushing those costs, that are driving those costs into fiscal 22, we've assumed 12-minute headways. So right now we're operating at 15-minute headways. 12 minutes is what we've been historically operating. And as the pandemic hit, in response to labor force availability, the number of operators that we had, we pulled back to 15 minutes. So rather than a train coming every 12, we have a train coming every 15. We anticipate continuing to operate at 15 minutes through the rest of this fiscal year for several reasons, operator availability. We also have we're expanding our maintenance facilities, so there's a lot of disruption there. A lot of work involved with moving trains around within the facility to accommodate the expansion. And then, as we'll hear about later, we have some single tracking related to construction in downtown that we'll be implementing. So we want to be sure to get through those expansion projects, the single tracking, and ensure that we have operator availability before we get back to our 12-minute headways currently planned for likely fiscal 22. But driving those costs then, alternate concepts, that is the contract that provides our operators, supervisors, they do the operations for us. We're contractually, we have contractual increases. They're showing 6%, but we've actually refined that when we get to the final budget. It's about actually a 4% increase. Propulsion power is also another main driver here. We buy our power from APS and SRP, so we have some inflationary increases built in there. And as I mentioned when I briefly discussed our preliminary budget, we start with a much higher contingency than we finish, so we have a 5%. We'll refine that down as we continue to refine all the other costs, so we'll end up with a contingency that's probably in the 1%, if not less range. Just a quick note on our safety and security. Our current contract expires at the end of this fiscal year. We have some assumptions in our current budget and through the current budgeting process of about a 5% increase. That procurement for a new contract is ongoing. We're evaluating those proposals now. We anticipate bringing that to the board in March. So we should have new rates, whatever those are negotiated through the procurement process, in time to incorporate those into the final budget by May. But for now, we've estimated about a 5% increase as more of a placeholder while we do that procurement. So I have a couple of slides just to talk about kind of the maintenance effort and what it takes looking at our maintenance of light rail. The first looks at just our inspection process, and this is what we do to inspect our vehicles. You can see down at the bottom, daily inspections, they take about 40 minutes a piece, but we do over 1,000 of those a month. We look at every vehicle every day. We do a monthly inspection cycle. We do quarterly inspections, 180-day or biannual inspections, 10-year inspections with the number of hours shown for each of those types. And so we're looking at basically 1,800 hours, person hours each month just to do vehicle inspections for preventive maintenance. So it's a significant effort to ensure that we're inspecting the vehicles to make sure that we catch anything so they don't end up as service interruptions when they go out for service the next day. The next slide talks a little bit about some of those midlife overhauls, some of those overhauls that we do to ensure the life of these vehicles. They're 30-year vehicles, so we have a lot of work to do periodically. These are time-based. So you can see we have some overhauls that are done every 5 years. We're working on friction brake overhauls, a 6-year overhaul for pantographs, 10-year overhauls for gear units and couplers and door units, 15-year overhauls, which is a significant midlife effort. You can see it's 1,000 hours per unit to do one of these 15-year midlife overhauls. And then some one-time things are line filter choke, which is related to bringing power in from the overhead lines, and our communication system for each of the vehicles. So a significant number of hours to do overhaul to keep those vehicles in proper operating conditions so they can meet their 30-year life. So significant effort there. Moving on to the next slide. Just kind of highlighting the hours there. As I noted, we're planning to implement our streetcar operations in fall. As with light rail, our operators and supervisors will be through the ACI contract. In the current fiscal year, we have additional streetcar maintenance in place so that as we receive the vehicles, we have the maintenance staff in place to help test and onboard and get those vehicles ready for revenue service. So for next fiscal year, we'd be looking at additional 2 track maintainers, and 2 traction power technicians to support that service. We're looking at initially a free fare period for streetcar. Then the last item I wanted to mention on the Valley Metro Rail budget, this is really in the capital budget, is what we call our state of good repair. Much like the LRV overhauls, these are major maintenance items that are done periodically, not as part of our annual maintenance for the rest of the system. So periodic maintenance, such as just some examples here from our current capital improvement program, repainting our existing fleet to the Valley Metro colors, repainting passenger stations that are 12, 13 years old, just to give them a good refresh, asphalt repairs, and then some station fencing. So these are more major type of maintenance items that are periodic in nature. So with that, those are kind of the items I wanted to highlight on the Valley Metro Rail budget. We are continuing to move forward, refining both the Valley Metro Rail and the RPTA budget, looking for beginning to present those preliminary budgets through our financial working group and then through our committee process next month and in March. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any additional questions the boards may have.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Chair Edwards, this is Robin. I got just a couple things.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. And I just want to make sure we've gone through all the slides, right?
Pardon me?
We went through all the slides, right?
Yes.
Got it, all 20. Okay, got it, all of them. Well, and I just want to say thank you for a very thorough presentation, much appreciated. And I think I want to just, again, thank the Audit and Finance Subcommittee because, as you know, one of our responsibilities is always to kind of take a deeper dive at some of these things that maybe the board is seeing for the first time or not that frequently. And we get the opportunity to look at it more frequently with Paul and ask a lot of really hard questions and get some data and some information. And I think one of the things that, we continue to, when we talked about it from the AFS perspective, was really just trying to making sure that we were being fiscally responsible and a little bit conservative moving forward. I hear a lot about the ability and how lucky we are that we actually have care funds and then care funds for the next year, which is going to be very beneficial, I think, to be able to keep us in a good place with Valley Metro as a region, which is really nice. And I think we're looking at what kind of landing are we going to have once those one-time dollars goes away. And it was really important for the Audit and Finance Subcommittee to really make sure that we were not only being optimistic, but that we were also taking a conservative approach too, and just kind of ensuring that we were being responsible with all taxpayers' dollars in case there is some uncertainty of revenue reductions. And as we know, the PTF seems to be very solid in moving forward, but some of those of us, like the city of Tempe, that does use a lot of local dollars, definitely do have some concerns. So I'm not really sure if that's the intent moving forward, to not necessarily just be fairly optimistic, which is nice, but to also make sure that we are holding on to that fiscal restraint and really understanding these are really uncertain times. And the CARES money is really nice, a great relief, but it's not permanent. It is one-time money that's going to help us get to the other side when the other side comes through and we can see the light. I think we all look forward to that. But, very important for us to still maintain some fiscal restraint moving forward, making sure that we can hit all these benchmarks as we go through it. I know one of the things I've noticed in the budget, when you look at the rail budget from FY20 was about 50.9 million, and then you look at FY22 is 64.1 million. So we are continuing to see increases in our operating expenses. And I just want to make sure that when some of these one-time money goes away, we've got to be really cognizant that we are going to be in a good place for our community. So I would ask the Audit and Finance Subcommittee, what your thoughts are. I know that you guys have all taken a really deep dive and you've been very vigilant of asking some really difficult questions, and I appreciate that. And if there's any input that you'd like to provide, I think now would be a really good time. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Robin. Anyone else?
Mr. Chair, this is Bill.
Yes, sir, Bill.
So I definitely would echo Robin's concern that we cautiously go into, and I don't know that I'm certainly not suggesting that we've recklessly gone into the next fiscal year, but 22 seems to be have a little bit more certainty with CARES funding, but as Robin pointed out, using one-time money to get us through on ongoing operations that's certainly a hazard that I think we all in local government understand, and I'm confident that Paul does as well. But I think going forward, we really need to look at kind of keeping a firmer grip on where we're headed. I'm always encouraged when Scott talks about changes that have been made to the operation to keep expenses down, et cetera. From an audit and finance subcommittee perspective, I'd certainly like to hear a little bit more about that at that meeting, so that we have some more confidence going into this upcoming budget season. But I think overall we're all trying to be cautiously optimistic at this point because we're tired of being pessimistic. I think just collectively as a society. So, but that's not time for us to sit back in our chairs and put our feet up. I think we've got to keep a firm grip on it. So I appreciate Paul's effort and everyone on staff at Valley Metro.
Thank you, Bill.
John, it's Lauren.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to also support what Chair Arredondo Savage said and Vice Mayor Stipp said. I mean, we're all well aware that it's not best practice to use one-time funding for ongoing expenses. I mean, it sets a dangerous precedent. So I think we all need to be cognizant that, I mean, and I know as a board, we've been preaching fiscal restraint because we really, I mean, this is all of our first pandemic. We don't really know, you know, I mean, that we just don't know how long it's going to take to get through this. And we also don't know if the ridership is going to return. I was really surprised at the decrease in ridership of rail. And I mean, I don't know what kind of data we have on riders of rail, but you know, are people going to continue to telecommute? I mean, are we going to see a downturn in ridership overall because people are now used to virtual? You know, how many ASU students and how many GCU students are going to say, I like going to school online. I'm not going to commute to school anymore. I mean, we just don't know. I mean, there's a lot of variables, whether, I mean, we can say, yes, our ridership, you know, we're past the pandemic, but is the ridership going to return? We don't know the answers to those questions. I mean, this is going to change our society overall and the way a lot of people do things. So, I mean, there are going to be I think a pretty good amount of population and businesses who say, I don't need all this office space. I don't need to have all of my employees in the office every day. That's going to affect our revenues going forward as well. So I think it's, as Bill said, I don't want to be a pessimist, but I do want to be a realist, is that I don't want to be overly optimistic that our fare revenues are going to return to what they were before, because we really don't know. We just really don't know the answer to that question. So, you know, I've said it every time, fiscal restraint is important because I'd be shocked if our ridership returns back to what it was pre-pandemic, because people have become accustomed to meeting virtually. And it's, you know, it saves gas, it saves time, you know, all of those things. So I just don't know that we should be relying on our revenues returning to what they were before, because we just don't know that it's going to happen or not. That's it for me.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, Paul, thank you so much. Scott, thank you so much for the presentation. I look forward to what you guys are going to present to us in the budget during the process in April. And I hope that the AFS team will continue to stay on top of this, and you guys will be working together so that they can vet it and bring it back to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So that will convene the study session for today. And I think we're a little bit behind, but I think we're good. So does anybody need to take a quick break before we convene, start the meeting? We'll take a 3-minute restroom break.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, why don't we take a 3 to 5 minutes so we can, Pat can do the changeover and we
Perfect.
can get that done, okay?
Perfect.
So maybe, yeah, 4 minutes.
Okay.
One?
Mr. Chair, we're ready to go when you are, sir.
Okay, Pat, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and call the January 21st, 2021 board meeting to order. And we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if everybody will please rise and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I want to take a quick note and welcome Vice Mayor Veronica Malone from the city of Avondale to the board. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
And also want to welcome back board member Mayor Bridget Peterson from the town of Gilbert. Welcome back, Bridget.
Thank you, Chair Edwards. I appreciate that and glad to be back with all of you.
Pat, would you take a roll call for us, please?
Yes, Vice Mayor Veronica Malone, City of Avondale.
Here.
Councilmember Clay Goodman, City of Buckeye. Mayor Kevin Hartkey, City of Chandler. Mayor Alexis Hermosillo, City of El Mirage. Councilmember Mike Charnow, Town of Fountain Hills. Mayor Bridget Peterson, Town of Gilbert.
Here.
Councilmember Lauren Tomachoff, City of Glendale. I know that she's here. City of Goodyear, Vice Mayor Bill Stipp. Supervisor Jack Sellers, Maricopa County.
Here.
Councilmember Francisco Heredia, City of Mesa.
Here.
Vice Mayor John Edwards, City of Peoria.
Here.
Mayor Kate Gallego, City of Phoenix.
Here.
Mayor Gail Barney, Town of Queen Creek.
Here.
City of Scottsdale is not represented today. City of Surprise, Councilmember Roland Winters.
Here.
Councilmember Robin Arredondo Savage, City of Tempe.
Here.
City of Tolleson is not attending today. Mayor Rui Pereira, Town of Wickenburg.
Here.
And Mayor Michael LaVault, Town of Youngtown.
Yes, Pat, I'm here.
Okay, we're all set to go, Chair.
Thank you, ma'am. If a committee member would like to ask a question or make a comment during the meeting, please type in your comment in the box and it'll be read out loud and answered. All meeting attendees, would you please mute your computer microphones or your phones? And with that, the first item on the agenda would be public comments. For today's meeting, public comments are being taken in a written format and will be entered into the official minutes of the meeting. Item number 2, the Chief Executive Officer's Report, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to everyone. Happy New Year. Since this is our first meeting of 2021, a special welcome to Vice Mayor Malone and a welcome back to Mayor Peterson. Glad to have you with us. Wish we were here in person, but we're not, so a Zoom or WebEx welcome and congratulations to all of you. The first thing is an update on COVID CARES report or CARES activities. I think Paul gave a very detailed explanation as to the funding that's available through what we call CARES Act 2 that will provide us significant money in our urban area for transit operations. Just to reiterate, $86 million that will primarily be available through beginning in fiscal 22 because we've used CARES Act 1 money to offset approximately almost $200 million in transit expenses in the current year. It has been a great help to all of us as we've been able to maintain service levels and take care of, next slide please, take care of our essential workers. And we continue to do extra work to make sure that our facilities are clean, our operators and our employees are protected, and our riders have the highest level of safety that they possibly can And I think just to give you an update, when we started requiring masks, we didn't do a heavy enforcement, but we're happy to say that we get consistent reports from our field workers, and our mask compliance is well above 99%. It's sort of like, it doesn't kill 100% of the turns, 99.9. That's really where our mask compliance is. So our riders are really doing their effort to stay as safe as possible in this environment. We had told you in December about the Federal Transit Administration approving the South Central Downtown Hub $530 million. Now let that sink in. $530 million grant. Well, they approved it in December and actually signed the grant in a virtual ceremony. This is Deputy Administrator K. Jane Williams signing the grant agreement to fund that, which takes a significant achievement. A lot of people involved. Congratulations to all Valley Metro staff, City of Phoenix staff who worked with us diligently on this, and our elected leaders who all pitched in to culminate a arduous, multi-year process to get that funding and ensure construction on that project. Also took the next stage with their other light rail expansion, which is also under construction. There's a former board member and Phoenix Councilmember Thelda Williams her district, talking about the Northwest Extension Phase 2. That'll take us to Metro Center. The FTA, about a day or two after they announced the South Central grant signing, announced about a $50 million allocation. That's not a formal commitment, but sort of a set aside for money so that when we get the full funding grant agreement, hopefully sometime this summer, late summer is what we're pushing for, maybe early fall, that will then be, that commitment will be solidified. So we're moving right along, and if you're driving along Dunlop or 25th Avenue, you will see construction on that extension. We want to congratulate one of our esteemed board members, Mayor Rui Pereira from Wickenburg, who was named Wickenburg's Man of the Year. And for those of us who have been working with the mayor, we know that is richly deserved, and we are proud to count you as one of our board members. And the only problem is now you've set a standard, we're all going to have a hard time meeting. So congratulations and shame on you all at the same time.
That's pretty funny.
Do you have anything to say for yourself?
Thanks for putting me on the spot there, Scott. That's great.
Well, if I'm going to put you on the spot, at least it's for a great reason. So thank you and congratulations for your good work.
Well, I appreciate the recognition. Thank you very much.
We also want to recognize, speaking of recognitions, we also want to recognize our 2021 Cool Transit Stuff Calendar winner. And you can see these things. The winner the theme was Miles of Smiles on Valley Metro, on this year's Best in Show winner. Adita Parihar, a student at Paragon Science Academy in Chandler, came up with some really fun. I love these things because the kids show so much creativity and so much talent. And I love the colors they come up with. And you can see the winner of the Cool Transit Stuff Calendar for this year. And congratulations to you, Aditya. Want to go over the calendar for the next few months. I think most of you received notification that we will not hold a board meeting in February. There will be an Audit and Finance Subcommittee. We will see you back in March for a full agenda, but we wanted to give you Valentine's Day month off so you could go celebrate as you needed, and we'll come back in March and get back to business. So, Mr. Chair, that is my report.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Okay, item number 3 would be the minutes. So the minutes for the November 19th, 2020 joint meetings are presented for approval. I need a motion and a second to approve the revised November 13th, 2020 board meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, item number 4 would be the consent agenda. The consent agenda is presented for action. Are there any board members that have any questions on any of the items that need to be pulled for separate discussion?
Mr. Chair, I have a question on the federal transportation agenda.
Yes, Mayor. We'll go ahead and pull that. Oh, actually, do you want to ask the question now?
I actually was hopeful it could be continued. On Tuesday, I requested some information about our federal representation and would love it to be continued until I can get that information.
Okay. That'll work. So we'll pull that piece off and have that pulled for the next board meeting.
But on positive news, Senator Sinema during the DOT confirmation hearings has been very much fighting for more transit funding for our region. So some good news from DC this morning.
That's always good to hear. Absolutely. Okay, well, with that item pulled, do I have a motion?
I'm sorry, was that a motion to table? If it was, I second it.
Yes, that was a motion to table.
I second.
We have a second. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have that item tabled. So what I need for the rest of the consent agenda would be a motion.
Motion to approve item 4A.
Thank you.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. And I'll go the opposite way. Is there anybody that is not in favor? Okay, so motion for consent agenda carries. Okay, item number 5 would be the light rail single track operation plan for downtown Phoenix Hub subconstruction. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you've driven into the downtown area of Phoenix recently, you know that there's significant construction activity going on with the South Central Extension Downtown Hub, and that will necessitate some changes in operations. We wanted to go over very quickly, briefly with you, what these changes will be in the next couple of months, so you are aware of them, because it will impact the ability to coordinate with buses and other things, and we'll have some issues along the entire line. So I'm going to turn it over to, I guess, probably Luis. Is that who I'm turning over to? Luis Mota, who is our project manager for the South Central Extension Downtown Hub. Luis?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Scott. So hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Luis Mota, project manager for South Central and Downtown Hub. So as some of you may be aware, the South Central Downtown Hub project requires installation of special track and other track that affects the entire light rail system. So today, I'm going to give you a brief presentation to cover the scope of work and our approach, talk about some of the impacts and the considerations for the customers that we took into account with our planning process, as well as how we handled the communication and operation discussions. So let's see, bear with me here. There you go. Okay, so to start off with just a quick project overview of South Central Extension and Downtown Hub. As you may know, it's a 5.5 mile extension of new track from downtown to Baseline and Central, connecting the South Central to downtown. The key element is for today's discussion is the Downtown Hub. It facilitates a future, more mature two-line system by accommodating east-west and north-south movements through downtown. And so we're going to zoom into the Downtown Hub just to show you the configuration briefly. Here, the new station will have 3 new platforms in the hub area surrounding the cityscape. So in total, the 4 platform locations are meant to accommodate those transfers between future east-west and north-south lines. So in order to facilitate the new train movements, new track and special track works required. So on this slide here, show you the new hub design includes 9 interface points with the existing light rail system. These include, as I mentioned, not just new track, but special track work that overlaps the existing track, which means construction requires shutting down the affected track. And each installation, as you can see here, requires anywhere from 4 days to 28 days of impact to the existing system. And then similar to what we did on Tempe streetcar for the single tracking, it's based on the nearest crossover points. So the nearest crossover points are what determines the headway impacts. In this case, the 2 nearest crossover points are at the north end at Culver, north of McKinley on Central, and then at 11th Street between Washington and Jefferson there. So the crossing point, these locations make a big difference because when one track's down, only one train can traverse the downtown area at a time in either direction, while the opposing train has to wait for the track to clear. So based on the spacing, the station frequency, the traffic, and the number of lights, the best configuration or the best spacing we can do is a 30-minute headway for a reliable schedule adjustment. And the same thing on the other track. But on the plus side, when we construct these, the project does include the two new crossover locations that for this first single tracking operation, once they're completed, we'll have a new crossover location at 5th Street and at McKinley. Now there's a crossover at McKinley, but this improvement accommodates crossover movements from the north, so you can properly use it for single tracking. So we'll build these first. The goal is to activate the new crossovers before installing the more impactful hub special track work, and to have a better train schedule and the downtown hub work happens. Another approach that worked well in Tempe Streetcar was combining the work to reduce the amount of events affecting the train schedules. Instead of applying 9 separate single tracking events, we were able to combine them into groups to minimize the number of events. This approach results in less single tracking events. It provides more flexibility to address surprises while we're meeting the schedule. It's also easier to communicate to the public, and again, the positive that I mentioned earlier, that it accommodates the 2022 single tracking for the more impactful downtown hub area. So scheduling was based on a few key factors, and you have there's a schedule in front of you. The ridership, we took into account the current pandemic impacts. More so too was the special track availability. It's a long lead item. It was dependent on federal authorization, which we did a preliminary, what we called a letter of no prejudice, to obtain early authorization to do that. So the special track work delivery worked with the team to have that adjusted to get us done as early as we can in the year, while it's still likely that we have ridership below average. And while, even if things start returning to normal, you still have that working your way to those pre-COVID levels. So the work starts now. We have pre-demolition work that's actively happening at 5th Street in Washington and at McKinley to prepare. And this is as much pre-demo as we can do so that it shortens the duration of the single tracking duration. Here are the dates for the different locations, the way we've been able to combine them. For now, we've been able to combine locations 1, 2, and 3 into one event, and 3, 4, and 5 into another single event. So the downtown hub work in 2022 is currently under review. A lot of it will be based on taking the feedback from how the downtown single tracking works with this first run. We just want to make sure we take the best of everything. So our preparation for this, we assembled 4 key task forces as we did previously. Construction planning is our first task force. That includes very detailed planning, including hour-by-hour schedules, material reviews, make sure we have all the materials we need before we start working. The second task force is for safety and security, and they cover every aspect of safety, not just the public, but also for the construction personnel. Our third group for operations, very broad. It covers everything from creating new train schedules to negotiating temporary operator agreements and the evaluation of bus schedule impacts, which has been a question. But so I'll quickly highlight that with regard to the bus impacts, we did look at the bus schedules and compared it against the temporary headway schedule. And the analysis did show that revising the bus schedules temporarily for this 2-week period actually created a greater passenger impacts on a network-wide level was the issue. So anyways, just wanted to throw that in there because it's a question that's asked. And then so the last task force is the communications and public outreach group. Also very intense planning process for the single tracking, just to make sure that everyone knows what's happening. So with that, speaking of communications and public outreach, I'm going to pass it over to Madeline Phipps, who's been very busy preparing for this, to give you a quick overview on the plan for that.
Hi everyone, I'm Madeline Phipps. I'm a public information specialist here at Valley Metro. We have been working for the last couple months to prepare a lot of different tactics to make sure that our riders and the public are well aware of all this work. So this is just kind of a high-level overview of some of the things we have planned. We'll be doing station announcements at all of our light rail stations. We also have onboard bus announcements. So throughout both bus and light rail system, hopefully riders are very aware. We'll also be using rider alerts on our website and through the Alert VM app. We're also creating a dedicated web page that has all this information and updated schedules for rail riders so they can check there. We're beginning a social media campaign, both organic and paid. We're also posting signs at all the light rail stations, park and rides, as well as some of the bus lines that have a high rate of bus to rail transfers between them. Of course, we have our customer experience coordinators, our frontline staff who work throughout the system to educate riders before and during this work. We'll be doing some media outreach and advisories. We also have our community outreach team that has been hard at work meeting with a lot of different stakeholders in the downtown Phoenix area, and then organizations whose employees, or if they have events, those people might be using the light rail to travel there, mostly Phoenix, Tempe, and Mesa. And then also coordinating with our member cities on different ways that we can communicate through some of their channels as well. And all of this starts next week, so it's hard to believe, but it's finally here. And I think that's it. Thanks, Luis.
Yeah, thanks, Madeline. So just to wrap it up, the summarize with some of the benefits, but overall, we've taken what worked well on our previous single tracking event for Tempe streetcar. The biggest consideration in all of this planning is to the customer is combining the work at multiple locations so that we reduce the number of single tracking events. So this helps us in many ways. It may be a longer duration all at one time, but you have less events. This results in clearer messaging, more consistent schedules during that period, more reliable service. And the other added benefit is that combining all this work together provides extra level of assurance of finishing on time. And again, same approach as we did on Tempe streetcar, because when you're working on multiple locations, you have the flexibility to address surprises. We do underground work, and so those are sure to happen. We can always move trades around to make sure we're addressing it. The key to this too, though, is to establish expectations for the public. So thus the portions that Madeline just covered. We put a lot of effort to move the first round of work as early as possible so that our longest headways take place before things return back to normal. In summary, that's all of it that we have for today, and welcome any questions.
Thank you. Is there any committee members that have any questions? Okay, well, this item was for presentation information only. Okay, item number 6 would be the travel expenditures and solicitations. This item is presented for information only. Are there any questions? Okay. Item number 7 will be future agenda items requests. Are there any members that want to place any future agenda items on a meeting?
Mr. Chair, it's Lauren. I do have an item I'd like to have on a future agenda item. I had requested this information in Audit and Finance Subcommittee, but I'd like to have staff bring back basically an evaluation of our current office space. And we had talked, I mean, I know we've got a lot of people telecommuting now. When is our lease up? Can we sublease? I mean, we've got a lot of floors in that US Bank building that we're occupying that probably aren't being used right now. And then if we're looking at doing something different with contractors, I've heard that there's contractors in the building that have office space in Valley Metro and things like that. So maybe just to kind of take a deep dive, and if you want to bring that back to Audit and Finance rather than the full board, that would be fine with me. But I'd like to put that on the agenda. I think every business that's occupying a lot of office space is looking at this type of thing right now to decide, what are we going to do going forward? And then one other thing, I would like to congratulate the newly installed Mayor of Gilbert, Mayor Bridget Peterson. Congratulations, Bridget, and welcome back. You were missing from the board for a few months, and congratulations. Happy to have you back.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate that. And I'm really glad to be back with all of you.
Perfect. So Lauren, would you like that to bring, you want to take it to the AFS committee first?
Wherever staff wants to bring it, I'm fine with them. I don't know whether the board wants to go into that much detail. Either place, but I think it bears at least starting to take a look at. I thought that our lease we had some space that the lease was going to be coming up, whether we want to renew all that. I just think that's, we're going forward are we going to have more people telecommuting? Do we need all that office space? So
Sure.
I'm not sure exactly, if the board's interested in that much detail, and if they're not, then we can bring it to audit and finance subcommittee. So it doesn't matter to me.
And Ms. Chair, we can do that. We've obviously already started that analysis. Most of our major leases are tied to the Prop 400 funding, so they run out in 2025, early 2026. And we've already done a study to try to understand exactly what Councilmember Tomachoff said. So we'll be more than happy. I think I'll coordinate with Paul and probably bring information back to audit and finance since we meet before we do back with the board.
Perfect.
We can do that.
Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment, Scott.
Is there anyone else that has anything they want to put on a future agenda? Okay. Item number 8 would be the next meeting. The next meeting of the board is scheduled for Thursday, March 18th, 2021 at 11:15 in the morning. And with that, we are adjourned. Are we there?
We're ready to start the RPTA agenda.
Okay. Just got to get that one open. And for some reason, I can't get that one open.
I'd be happy to help you, Chair. The first item on the agenda is public comment. We're accepting public comment in written format today, and I have not received any prior to the beginning of the meeting.
Okay.
The next item is the minutes from October 22nd, 2020. I'll remind the board that RPTA did not meet in November, and that is why we're approving October minutes today. So if we could get a motion and a second for approval.
So moved. This is Bill.
I'll second. This is John. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 All those opposed? The motion carries. Go ahead.
Okay, the next item is the consent agenda. Are there any items that any board member has questions on or would like removed from the agenda for today? There are no questions, Chair.
Okay, so I need a motion and a second for the consent agenda.
So moved.
First, so do we have a second?
I'll second. This is Bill.
Bill, we have a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed? Motion carries.
Okay. There are no regular agenda items today, unless there are any future agenda item requests from board members. Okay, hearing none, the next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, March 18th at 11:15 a.m. That's the end of the agenda, Chair.
And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take a minute so folks can step out.
Chair, I believe we're ready.
We're ready? All right.
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome everybody to the January meeting. Item number 1, public comment for today's public meeting. It's being taken in written format and will be entered into the official minutes of the meeting. Item number 2, minutes. The minutes from the November 19, 2020 board meeting are presented for approval. Request a motion and a second to approve the meeting minutes.
Move approval?
Second. I think Robin said second, right? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Robin. Anyone opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Item number 3, consent agenda. Consent agenda is presented for action. Anyone have any questions or comments or an item to be pulled from the consent agenda? Hearing none. I request a motion and a second for approval.
So moved.
Second.
Perfect. Anyone opposed? Seeing none, motion carries. Item number 4, future agenda items, requests. Any members have any future items for a future meeting? Hearing none. Next meeting is on March 18th. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.